Hello, welcome to this online webinar. That's A1, an early history of Lloyd's Register. I'm Max Wilson. I'm the Archivist for the Heritage and Education Centre. And just before we get started, I had one or two bits of housekeeping that I wanted to go through. So first things first, everybody's microphones are muted. There is an opportunity to ask some questions. If you notice on the panel on the right-hand side, you should just be able to type out any questions that you have. I've got some very handy helpers that are in the background who are able to answer some of your questions, particularly if they're things about links to certain areas of the website. Yeah, questions I will get to at the end of the webinar. So anything also that I don't have an answer to in front of me right then and there, we will be publishing a list of all the questions with an answer once I finally got one. So we are still learning with the online webinar format. Unfortunately, I do also have a building site next to me as well. So I've isolated myself a little bit to try and minimize the distractions and disturbances. So bear with me. Hopefully nothing should go wrong. So without further ado, let's start. Firstly, thank you very much as well for attending. Just looking at the numbers at the moment, and it's really phenomenal. Yeah, thank you all very much for logging on and listening in. So, for those of you that don't really know very much about Lloyd's Register was the very first classification society, the very first maritime classification society in the world. And for those of you that maybe don't really know what that means, this presentation will hopefully illuminate you and enlighten you a little bit about some of the history of Lloyd's Register, what we did, a little bit about what we're doing as well now, and what the history of our great organisation is. So if you know anything about us, it's Lloyd's Register is crucially about safety, which isn't always the most engaging subject to cover. So I think the very first place to start really should be disaster. So I'm going to go through with peril on the sea. I'm going to go and talk a little bit about our origins, and then just keep going forward all the way through to our reconstitution. And then I'm going to also end with some interesting stories and discoveries that we've made from the archive, which has all been really, really exciting. So disaster. Obviously, the need for safety has arisen out of a chronic disasters at sea. And so I wanted to really highlight one really interesting case study, and this was the East India Company ship, the Halswell. So it was wrecked on the 6th of January, 1786. So it had set off from London for Madras when she was caught during a very heavy storm. She lost her masts and was basically driven straight onto the rocks at the very base of a cliffside just off of Dorset at about 2 in the morning. So it was a really brutal wreck, and essentially when it was dashed against the rocks, all of the passengers and the crew on board that weren't initially killed outright had to scramble into the caves and clamber onto rocks, and then try and scramble up the side of the cliff face to safety. So people who were able to survive and onlookers who were there at the cliff's edge said that really the wreck had basically disintegrated after about an hour. Though it was also reported that bits of copper wooden planking were still being washed up as late as 1856. So it was a major international disaster, not least because there was it was very heavily romanticized as well. The captain stayed behind with his family and then was sadly washed away with the waves when the wreck started to break up. But it achieved major national coverage. King George III went to visit the wreck site a few days afterwards, and Charles Dickens also wrote a little bit about the wreck of the Halswell in 1853 in his short story, The Long Voyage. Now, it's probably worth saying at this stage that the Halswell was actually a very well-built ship. It was an East India Company ship, so for anybody that knows a little bit about the East India Company and the way that they were building ships, they built them to a very high standard. Quite often, they were built pretty much next to Navy standard, and a lot of people who were on the seas would frequently mistake them due to their sheer size as naval vessels. However, this wasn't always the case. As you can see, if a ship that was as well built as the Halswell couldn't survive a disaster like this, it remains to be seen exactly how well a ship that wasn't so well built would be able to survive. And as I said, there were an awful lot that didn't survive and weren't particularly well constructed. And out of this need, there was a real desire for safety and for regulation. This disaster happened in, as I said, 1786. Lloyd's Register was founded in 1760. And this really coincides with a major jump in shipping generally. So in 1788, there are about 50,000 British merchant seamen. By about 1830, this had jumped to about 130,000. And again, likewise, in 1788, you had about 12,464 ships that were registered to ports around the United Kingdom. And again, this jumps up again to just over 19,000 by the 1830s. So as you can see, there was a major need to try and mitigate risk with this huge burgeoning shipping industry and the growth in trade. So my colleague Charlotte Ward, she covered this in her webinar the other week on Edward Lloyd's coffee house and coffee house culture generally in the 18th century, which hopefully some of you may have listened to. For those of you that haven't, it has been recorded, so please feel free to go back and have a listen. I highly recommend it. So as a result of that, I'll just do a very brief recap about some of this. So Lloyd's Register was originally founded in Edward Lloyd's coffee house. It was actually started out as the Society for the Registry of Shipping, and it was founded in Edward Lloyd's coffee house at Lombard Street, actually not far from our current offices at 71 Fenchurch Street. And as some of you may have realised, this is actually where the Lloyd's name comes from. So Lombard Street, there is a picture of it there. So it's, as I said, just not very far, and there is the blue plaque, which signifies where it stood. So who was Edward Lloyd and what was his coffee house? He came to London sometime in the 1680s, we believe from Wales, and established his coffee house initially in Great Tower Street in 1688. But then a few years later, he then moved it to number 16 Lombard Street, which happened to be right in the heart of the city's maritime quarter. So very quickly, the coffee house, due to its really close proximity to maritime firms, underwriters firms, shipping companies and the docks, very quickly became seen to be it was seen to be the place that you needed to be if you wanted to learn something about shipping and maritime intelligence generally. So the coffee house passed out of the Lloyd's family, but all of the subsequent proprietors were really keen to keep up this specialism in maritime affairs. And this is a really good example of just how they were doing that. This is a business card for Robert Furness, who was a shipbroker based at Rotherhithe. But as well as obviously selling ships and the merchandise to the public, he also noted that he was quite happy to meet people at Edward Lloyd's coffee house as well. So it just goes to show really how far-reaching Edward Lloyd's coffee house had really become by the end of the 18th century. And from the end, from Edward Lloyd's coffee house, there have really been three great success stories. The first is the Corporation of Lloyd's, or Lloyd's of London, which was founded in 1686 for marine insurance. The second was Lloyd's List in 1734, which is one of the world's oldest continuously published journals and specialises in shipping intelligence and maritime affairs specifically. And lastly, the world's first classification society in 1760, Lloyd's Register. If you take nothing else from this presentation, we are not Lloyd's of London. We are completely separate. We have had a relationship in terms of kicking business back between each other, but we have always remained separate. So in 1760, Lloyd's Register was founded by a committee of 11 members, and it was basically formed out of a desire to class ships and try and provide accurate recorded information about the quality and condition of vessels based on their hulls and their equipment after a survey that had taken place by a qualified inspector. So it's about quality. But how was this information recorded? Well, it was recorded like this. So this is a page from our register book. Now, the register book was the very first publication of its kind, and it gave accurate and up-to-date information about the quality of materials and the construction of a ship's hull and its equipment. So the Society for the Registry of Shipping made money basically from subscriptions to the register, which then paid for surveys that were carried out. We know that the earliest subscribers paid around 10 guineas, which is about £1,500 in modern money. And classification was incredibly valuable for merchants, for ship owners, for mariners alike, for quite a few reasons, but we often get asked exactly why anybody would want to have their ship classed. And so obviously the first is safety. It was a really good way of regulating shipping in terms of the quality of construction and materials that were used. You saved lives, you saved your cargo, you saved money. And you also got lower insurance premiums as well. But you would obviously have to take that to an underwriter's firm to do that. It was also really handy if you wanted to check the status of a chartered ship for your cargo. So if a ship came if somebody came forward and offered the services of their ship and it had been registered, you could then look it up and verify that yes, it had been surveyed and it was to a particular standard. It was also really, really handy if you wanted to buy a ship and if you wanted to sell your ship as well. You could just look it up in the register book and then you could have a really good idea of the value of what you're buying, value of what you were selling. It was also really good for shipbuilders as well and ship owners, particularly shipbuilders, because it was able to give a really accurate, objective report of the quality of your ships and what you were building. So the register book was first published in 1764, and this is a page of the alphabetized register book, B, as you can see. And as you can see, it gives a really interesting idea of exactly what kinds of information was being was being looked at and what kind of information was being recorded generally. So it gives you the name, it gives you the former name, it gives you the builder, the tons, and also in these early years, for those of you that might have noticed, it gives you an idea of the guns as well. This is 1764, so we've not long finished warring with the French. And it's a really interesting document, and there's 4,118 ships inside it. The 2,000 of these are built outside the UK. And just to give an idea of scope, today the register book is about 5 volumes and consists of about 120,000 ships. So the most popular name was Nancy, and the largest ship at the time was the Prince Ferdinand, which is about 900 tons. And so for many years, LR had grades of classification, and the highest in the 1764 register book was AG, which you can just make out on the side. And so essentially the A denoted the quality of the hull, and it ranged from A, E, I, O, or U, and the G was for the equipment, so your masts, your rigging, your chains, your ropes, your anchors, and that stood for good, and you had a choice of good, middling, or bad. From 1768 onwards, this system was altered slightly to use numbers, and so the highest classification used was A1. So for anybody out there, A1 has now passed into common usage, and you will find it in the Oxford Dictionary, and it means first rate, the very best, and it was the most sought after classification in the industry. But how were they doing the surveys? With the formation of the register of the Society for the Registry of Shipping, we know that the surveyors were employed at about 16 major UK shipping ports and commercial ports, places like London, Liverpool, and Hull, as well as several other smaller places as well, like Topsham, Whitehaven, Chatham. But for all of the thousands and thousands of surveys that were carried out by surveyors in the course of their inspections, probably the best record that we have of their work are the register books themselves. So between the years 1760 and 1834, we hold comparatively few records of the numbers of surveys that were carried out. But thankfully, due to a few surviving letters and little interesting pieces that we've discovered in the archive over several years, we've been able to get together a rough idea of how these surveys were being recorded and how they were sent to London. So this particular item that you're seeing on your screen is one of my favorites. And it's because obviously it's able to tell us a lot about Lloyd's register, but it's also able to tell us a lot about the time and the history and the social commentary that it came This letter is particularly interesting because it survived, and it survived for a really interesting reason as well. So it was sent by the surveyor to Edward Lloyd's coffee house from Madeira, and the packet ship, the mail ship that was carrying the post, was intercepted by an American privateer. This was obviously right in the middle of the American War of Independence, so getting cargo to and from across the Atlantic and across the Mediterranean was a particularly big problem. Some weeks after it had been captured, the privateer was then intercepted and captured by a Royal Naval ship, which then took possession of all the captured mail. They took all of the bags to Gibraltar, where it was sorted, and then it was finally able to get to London, safely delivered to the coffee house 7 months later. And the reason that we know all of this is because it's actually recorded on the side there, and you can see a little excerpt of that on the right side of the screen. So for nearly 40 years, the Society for the Registry of Shipping had grown really steadily from strength to strength. And by the end of the 18th century, it had about 200 subscribers to the register book. The A1 status, the classification, was held in very high esteem. And it was a mark of quality that people respected. But things were changing as well at the same time. Shipbuilding was changing. Traditionally, a lot of this shipbuilding had been taking place in the south of Wales, the south of England, but gradually, over the course of the 18th century, it had moved up north. And by the end of the 18th century, it was seen that about 40% of shipping was actually being carried out in the north of England and in Scotland. There was obviously naturally a little bit of skepticism in London about the quality of the material and construction in these new ports that were seen as being outside of the reach of some of these surveyors. And so it was decided that this system of classification really had to change, and that crucially, the age of the ship and the place of the build would determine whether a ship was capable of achieving this A1 status and for how long it could retain it. So in reality, this was obviously out of trepidation at these new changes. It was also a way of trying to protect London shipping, because in reality, it meant that only ships that were built along the Thames could keep this A1 status. Obviously, if you were an up-and-coming shipbuilder who was operating outside of London, this quite understandably caused outrage. Unfortunately, the two sides of this debate, the underwriters and the ship owners, were unable to actually patch up their differences, and this caused a major split. But they didn't want to completely abandon this idea of a register book and of classification because it was so useful. And so basically the protesters against these measures, the ship owners, decided to set up their own register book under the name the Society of Merchants, Ship Owners and Underwriters, that was based in the city. And they issued their first register book in 1799, which became known as the Red Book there on the left. In contrast, the remaining half of the underwriters continued to produce the rival book, the Green Book, or the Underwriters Register. But quite well, fortuitously, this signaled a huge change in shipbuilding generally, and commerce, as we now know, grew exponentially. The value of trade in the UK jumped hugely, and if you measure that by the consumption of imports in the UK at about the time of the split, it was about 52 million pounds were being consumed all the time. That's pound in weight. By the time that, well, about 30 years later, this had jumped from 52 million to 248 million. As you can imagine, to meet this demand, shipbuilding and ship owning was rising at a really unprecedented level. And so obviously, both organizations had really kind of played a bad hand. They were splitting the market right down the middle, and it was driving them to financial ruin. It was very confusing. Both of them also laid claim to this A1 status. And so it was really, really confusing for people. Something had to change. And this came with the reconstitution. So there had been some inroads over the years to try and bring the two sides together, but everything had really failed until 1834. So after about a year of negotiations, the subscribers to these two societies, of the underwriters and of the ship owners, were finally brought together for a meeting at Lloyd's coffee house, of all places. And the argument was made for a reconstitution of the societies and a unification of the Red Register and the Green Register books. And it's really interesting because this exchange and this meeting is also recorded in the Times newspaper on the 21st of November, 1833. And David Carruthers, who chaired the meeting, wrote, and basically explained the problem that had befallen both societies. And he said, consequently, the two books were continued, but the funds necessary for their support had so dwindled away that the books might be said to have resulted the point of dying a natural death. This is also really interesting. As a result of this meeting, there was the suggestion for a unification. They also wanted £2,000 of investment to be able to unify and set themselves up properly. In these negotiations, one man, someone by the name of Mr. Sadler, recommended that the society should reform, and also that they should try and take on this Lloyd's name. They should really attach themselves to this honourable Lloyd's name that had such cachet within the maritime community. And he said, let's call it Lloyd's Register. Strangely, everybody hated that idea, and that received lots of boos and jeers, the Times reports. And in fact, the chairman of the meeting then stood up and said that that was a very bad idea. It wouldn't instill a great deal of confidence in the shipping community, and that let's not think about the name for a little bit. Let's shelve the idea. Luckily, they were able to secure that £2,000 investment at the meeting, and contrary to all of that, we emerged a year later as Lloyd's Register of British and Foreign Shipping. And this is a really, really important date in our history. It's a really landmark date as well, because we emerged on the 21st of October 1834 as Lloyd's Register of British and Foreign Shipping. It also sees us for the first time securing our very first semi-permanent office in London, which you can see there at the left, on the left there. It has survived, and it's number 2 White Lion Court in Cornhill. And that would be our rented home at a rate of about £175 a year from 1834 all the way to 1901 in our current head office on 71 Fenchurch Street. But at the same time, you also had rules for the classification of ships that were drawn up by this provisional committee. New exclusive surveyors were appointed at major ports across Britain and Ireland, and classification was going to be decided by this committee. And even more importantly, from the perspective of the archive, they then decided to draw up these brand spanking new reports of survey, and they looked like this. So, as you can see, this is something a little bit more, something a little bit more organized. It resembles something that we would recognize as obviously a form. And so the system had changed quite a bit from those letters that we saw previously, to the point now where surveyors would obviously go on their surveys, they would come home, they would fill out the survey report, and then they would then post these survey reports to London. The committee would deliberate, they would award a classification, they would send it to the printers, it would get printed, but amazingly, they then decided that they didn't need to throw them away, they would keep them. So in this instance, really, it's the birth of our archive, and it's the birth of the great part of our ship plan and survey report collection. And for anybody who's interested, we are digitizing this collection at the moment. It numbers roughly 1.25 million documents, approximately, and we are quite a way in at this point. We're about 200,000 documents in, and we have many more coming. So please, if you are interested, take a look at those, because there's some really interesting stuff there. This particular survey report, I should say as well, is for a really interesting ship called the True Love. So it was built in colonial Philadelphia in 1764, and it was captured. It was then turned into a whaling ship. It made, I believe, about 120 different voyages to the Arctic, and it was finally broken up in, I believe, 1891. So you can see that on our website. So by all means, please do take a look. So when Lloyd's Register was formed, one of the questions that we get an awful lot is how exactly was it run? And no presentation about Lloyd's Register would be complete without talking a little bit about this man on the left, who was the chairman of Lloyd's Register's General Committee, Thomas Chapman. Now, he's a really interesting man. He held this post after this very sudden death of David Carruthers, the man in the meeting at Edward Lloyd's Coffee House. And he held that post from 1835 all the way until he retired in 1881 at the age of 83. And he was a really interesting character, because not only was he very diplomatic, he was able to really keep these different disparate groups within Lloyd's Register together. He was obviously chairman of the General Committee. He was a ship owner. He was an underwriter. he was also the head of an import-export business as well. So you couldn't find a more perfect person to chair a committee with all of these different groups of people and represent everybody's businesses. So as well as being quite technically and technically minded and business minded as well, he was also a really interesting man, and a man of great feeling. So in 1836, a year after he took office, the society suffered a major setback, a financial setback. One of the junior clerks who'd been trusted with the care of about £700 worth of society money stole this money and made off to the continent, never to be seen again. And just as a frame of reference, £700 equates to about £42,000 in modern money. So this was obviously a major issue, and Lloyd's Register was on the rocks in terms of being able to pay their surveyors and their staff. And so Chapman stepped in. He took out a personal temporary loan to cover this cost and the cost of salaries, and then part of the society's investments were sold. The other thing I should say as well about Thomas Chapman as well is that he was also a very good fan, a very good friend of Charles Dickens. He knew Charles Dickens through some of his charity work, and it's believed instantly for any, for any Dickens fans that Thomas Chapman was the inspiration for Paul Dombey in his book Dombey and Sons. Although the character is quite far removed from Chapman's from Chapman's real personality. In fact, we actually think it might have been a private joke between himself and Charles Dickens. Another interesting Dickens fact as well, just before we move in, just before we move on as well, is that Dickens, in his capacity for collecting names and inspiration for his books, also saw this portrait, which we still have in our office on the right of your screens, which was an East India Company surveyor called Gabriel Snodgrass. And Dickens was so intrigued and amused by this name that he used the name Snodgrass for the inspiration of the character Augustus Snodgrass in the Pickwick Papers. So as you can see, he was a really interesting member of Lloyd's Register, and he really kept Lloyd's Register going and was responsible for a lot of these internal reforms, and was, as I say, an excellent ambassador for Lloyd's Register. But it wasn't all about Lloyd's Register in London. It was about Lloyd's Register in the local ports, in the outports, in these rural areas, in these heavy industrial centres as well. It was LR's foot soldiers, the surveyors. So when the society was reconstituted, we know that they appointed 13 exclusive surveyors to work at the busiest and largest ports around Britain and Ireland. So these adverts were circulated. They were aimed at shipwrights who'd had several years' experience in a shipyard, and for captains of experience who had experience in the quality and construction of ships as well. So of course, as you can imagine, a lot of these surveyors had to be trusted. They had to be skilled technically. They had to be hardworking, and particularly as a lot of them were working quite far away from their bosses in these isolated rural communities, they had to be trusted. And so one of the ways that Lloyd's Register got around this and really tried to get the best people possible was by paying them a really decent salary. So the average surveyor was paid between about £150 to £200 a year. And just for a frame of reference, a labourer was paid about £30 a year during this time. And bribery was a particularly big problem during this day and age, as it still remains obviously today in any kind of industry like this. And we're very lucky in that we've had some really amazing employees. One of these was our principal surveyor, who was offered a bribe whilst he was surveying a ship in the 1840s, and the principal surveyor actually threw him overboard when he offered that bribe. So yeah, really interesting. And the really interesting about a lot of these surveyors as well is that where they're operating so far away from their bosses, so far away from the metropolis and people who are checking up on them, it's really interesting to see that coming through in some of those letters that I'm just going to talk about a little bit later on. One notable example is the Leith surveyor, who was responsible for all of the surveys for Leith and the ports along the Firth of Forth. and his name was Walter Payton. Now, technically, he was only responsible for those ports, but in actuality, his records show that he was responsible for carrying out any survey requests between Berwick-upon-Tweed and Fife, as well as all of those ports along the Firth of Forth. So in actuality, that's about 120 miles. And a lot of the time he was doing that either by boat or by horse, because this had really, all of this had taken place really before the advent of the railway. I should say as well, if you're really interested in Walter Payton and the surveyor Leith, there is also an online story that's on our website, which has gone up today. So please do check it out, because he had a really interesting, amazing life, and that comes through a lot of his letters. So lastly, just before we start going on to some of these interesting stories that we're finding in the archive, I'm going to end it really in 1852, because this is again another major landmark year for Lloyd's Register, because it's the day, well, it's the date for when Lloyd's Register sent out its first exclusive overseas permanent surveyor, Thomas Mengis. Now, Lloyd's Register post-reconstitution had loads of requests from all over the world to appoint a surveyor to places like Egypt, Quebec, New Zealand. As you can imagine, for a lot of these ports, they were really anxious to try and have more of a regulation and a regulating influence in these parts of the world. Lloyd's Register perhaps overly cautiously resisted a lot of these urges, on the grounds that really they wanted to try and shore up and cement their footing in Britain and Ireland. But they finally relented in 1852 when to the requests of the Quebec Board of Trade, and they sent out Thomas Mengis to be the first overseas surveyor for Quebec and the St. Lawrence River. So Thomas Mengis was a former sea captain. Before that as well, he also had assisted his father, Robert Mengis, in his shipyard in Leith. And for anybody who's really interested in maritime history, that's quite a pedigree. Robert Mengis shipyard had been responsible for producing the Sirius, which was the very first vessel to cross the Atlantic from Europe to the United States under continuous steam power. So yeah, very, very, very rich maritime pedigree. And we've also got a really fantastic record within the minutes of our General Committee, notably on the 12th of February 1852, where they are reporting back that they've just received their first letter from Thomas Mengis, having safely arrived in Quebec. So he writes that he had just received an office at number 15 St. Peter's Street at a rate of £25 a year, and that he was looking to borrow £50 for office furniture and other necessities. But he also reports as well that having just arrived, he's also received several offers from different shipbuilders who are really anxious to have their ships surveyed, and they're large ships as well. One of them is 850 tons and the other is 1,300 tons. Since then, LR has obviously grown from strength to strength, and we now have a presence in 79 different countries. But that's where I'm going to end it, because I think that the story post 1852 is another story for another day and another webinar. So I'm going to turn instead to some of the stories from the stacks, some of the highlights from our archives. So if you're looking at this image here on the left, these are just a couple of images that I really like, because I think they really get a sense of what we have in the archive and what privilege it is to work with this material. So the image on the left here is actually a thumbprint, we believe from the Surveyor in the 1840s at Belfast. And likewise on the right, you can see this is also basically the back of a survey report from 1841, and it shows essentially the way that they were recycling paper and the way that they were writing over their writing and turning it around. From a cataloguing perspective, and for digitizing this material, it's been an absolute nightmare, material like this, being able to read it, because it's so hard to read writing over writing. But obviously they tried to distinguish this by using red pen and red ink. Yeah, it's, as I say, really difficult. So one of the major interesting stories that I came across in the archive, which I really wanted to highlight, some of those ones are, I think, particularly those ones that offer a social commentary. And one of these is a letter from John Jones, the surveyor at Barmouth, Port Maddox and Abu Dhabi. So he was active at those ports from 1838 to 1852, and in this particular letter, on the 30th of December 1850, he's basically been told off by the committee at London because they're questioning whether or not he's misled them in the description of a particular ship. And very anxiously, he writes back that I'm not very fluent in the English language, partly owing to want of early practice of it. I'm often short of suitable words to explain my intentions, which I hope the committee will overlook. And he goes on and continues and tries to correct some of these alterations and omissions. His first language was actually Welsh. It's a really interesting example, and a lot of the cases that we found, particularly some of his early writing, have included either he's frequently misspelled words, or he's used words sometimes incorrectly, and even occasionally he's substituted some words that he doesn't know in English for Welsh words, on the hope that the person at the other end will be able to try and decipher that. But it's really interesting to see, because it's not evidence of this kind of thing isn't always really as apparent as you would think. Another really, really interesting story as well is from the surveyor at Guernsey as well. So he was active again as the surveyor at Guernsey from 1834 to 1872. And he wrote this really interesting letter on the 16th of September 1854, in which basically he replies back to a letter again about another ship that the committee have queried. And he writes that he's been absent at the moment because he's had to accompany his daughter and his son-in-law and their family to Southampton, where they will then basically go to board a steamer, the Thames. He says that this is perhaps the last time he'll ever see his daughter again. Her husband is the Reverend Pendleton, who's just about to take up a missionary post at Montevideo. And so, of course, it's a really heartfelt goodbye. Unfortunately, he also says that on his way back, he stopped off at the Goodridge Hotel, and he had his portmanteau and the contents of his portmanteau were stolen, which contained actually £1,000 worth of his property. So he writes, I intended to return on the 12th instant, but unfortunately for me, my portmanteau containing £100 of property was stolen from the Goodridge Hotel just before embarking and caused my detention 2 days later. The portmanteau has not been returned yet. So yeah, we get an awful lot of this kind of thing, and it's a really interesting insight into some of the lives of these surveyors. Another case that I must admit I'd be remiss not to put in are the poison letters that we always get a lot of the time. So as you can imagine, these surveyors held an awful lot of sway with some of these in some of these communities, particularly for shipbuilders. That really meant that the surveyor held a huge amount of power in deciding how safe, what classification your ship got. And so it's quite frequent that builders who had a reputation for maybe not building particularly great ships or just being generally surly, you would usually get on the bad side of their surveyors, and they would frequently write complaining letters or sometimes threatening letters, as has been the case. And in this particular instance, James Wood, the surveyor at Bristol, the surveyor at Bristol with Chepstow and the River Wye, who was active from 1839 to 1857, has written a really comprehensive report of an annoying interaction, a really difficult interaction that he's had with a shipbuilder called Henry Follett. It's a really, really long extract, and it's really interesting because when you look at the document itself, you can tell that he's pressed really hard, and he's obviously written it in a very angry state. But essentially what's happened is that he was called to survey this ship. In the course of the survey, Henry Follett and his foreman are showing James Woods, the surveyor, around the vessel, the Avery. And in doing so, the surveyor is asked to see below decks to inspect some of the planking, and this has been refused. As a result of this, the surveyor said, "Well, fine then. If you're not going to show me what I need to see, then I'm going then." And so he leaves. He goes all the way. He takes the train. He's basically waiting at the train station for his train back to Tynemouth. And then the foreman runs back and says, "Oh, don't mind my uncle. I've sent my uncle away, Henry Follett, because he gets very angry." And James Wood replies back with this really great insult. He says, I replied that if I knew Mr. Follett to be my most deadly enemy, it would not influence me in the slightest degree in the execution of my public duty. And so, of course, he agrees to come back to the shipyard. He inspects the ship. He finds that they were actually trying to, this Henry Follett was trying to stop him from looking at certain parts of the ship because he knew that they were deliberately badly built. And so instead of then letting it go and writing up a report, as you might expect, James Wood instead decides, because he's so angered by this, to go to Henry Follett's house and tell him that he is a charlatan and that he has no business building ships, and basically says that he will put in a very bad word with the committee. And he then makes a sort of a parting remark in this letter, and basically sort of says that look kindly on this man because he can neither contain himself. Look kindly on this man because he can neither contain himself nor himself to the truth. So yeah, really interesting extract. But we get a lot of these really angry letters all the time, particularly from shipbuilders and ship owners. So those are some of the highlights that we've seen. I really hope that you enjoyed it. That is, I'm going to bring this to a close, but just before I do, and we go on to some of the questions, if anybody is interested, we have another upcoming webinar. This is by the Heritage Education Centre's Digital Content Manager, Sean Clemenson. He on the 20th of May at 1 p.m. Yards, yellow cards and shipyards. So discover the link between the beautiful game and the shipyards of old. So please do take a look at that, because it's definitely well worth it. Also, if anybody is really keen and they really want to get ahead of it, if you go to our website, which will just come on screen in a moment, you'll find in our What's On page that Sean has also written a really interesting blog about this as well. So yeah, please do check that out as well. So for further information, please check out any of the links there that you see there on the screen. Also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at LRFHEC for any updates and upcoming events. But if there are any questions, then please come through now. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. So if nobody has any questions, then I will end the webinar here and say thank you very much. It's a phenomenal turnout and we really appreciate it. So thank you all very much. And again, please take a look at our website, have a look at some of our online digital archives, and also any of our upcoming events, stories, blogs, or other material. We also have a podcast, Washed Ashore, that we've just launched as well. So again, please check those out. Thank you all very much for listening. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope everyone is able to stay safe during all of this. So thank you very much, and goodbye.